Chapter 18 of The Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 18. A Riddle of Faces. Just behind him stood two other doctors. One, the familiar Dr. Quayle, of the blinking eyes and bleating voice. The other, a more commonplace but much more forcible figure, a stout young doctor with short, well-brushed hair, and a round but resolute face. At the sight of the escape, these two subordinates uttered a cry and sprang forward, but their superior remained motionless and smiling, and somehow the lack of his support seemed to arrest and freeze them in the very gesture of pursuit. "Let them be," he cried, in a voice that cut like a blade of ice, and not only of ice, but of some awful primordial ice that had never been water. "I want no devoted champions," said the cutting voice. "Even the folly of one's friends bores one at last. You don't suppose I should have let these lunatics out of their cells without good reason. I have the best and fullest reason. They can be let out of their cell today, because today the whole world has become their cell. I will have no more medieval mummery of chains and doors. Let them wander about the earth as they wandered about this garden, and I shall still be their easy master. Let them take the wings of the morning and abide in the uttermost parts of the sea, I am there. Whither shall they go from my presence, and whither shall they flee from my spirit? Courage, Dr. Quayle, do not be downhearted. The real days of tyranny are only beginning on this earth." And with that the master laughed and swung away from them, almost as if his laugh was a bad thing for people to see. "Might I speak to you a moment?" said Turnbull, stepping forward with a respectful resolution. But the shoulders of the master only seemed to take on a new and unexpected angle of mockery as he strode away. Turnbull swung round with great abruptness to the two other doctors, and said harshly, "What in snakes does he mean, and who are you?" "My name is Hutton," said the short, stout man, "and I am, well, one of those whose business it is to uphold this establishment." "My name is Turnbull," said the other. "I am one of those whose business it is to tear it to the ground." The small doctor smiled, and Turnbull's anger seemed suddenly to steady him. "But I don't want to talk about that," he said calmly. "I only want to know what the master of this asylum really means." Dr. Hutton's smile broke into a laugh which, short as it was, had the suspicion of a shake in it. "I suppose you think that quite a simple question," he said. "I think it a plain question," said Turnbull, "and one that deserves a plain answer. Why did the master lock us up in a couple of cupboards like jars of pickles for a mortal month, and why does he now let us walk free in the garden again?" "I understand," said Hutton with arched eyebrows, "that your complaint is that you are now free to walk in the garden." "My complaint is," said Turnbull stubbornly, "that if I am fit to walk freely now, I have been as fit for the last month. No one has examined me, no one has come near me. Your chief says that I am only free because he has made other arrangements. What are those arrangements?" The young man with the round face looked down for a while and smoked reflectively. The other and elder doctor had gone pacing nervously by himself upon the lawn. At length the round face was lifted again, and showed two round blue eyes with a certain frankness in them. "Well, I don't see that it can do any harm to tell, you know," he said. "You were shut up just then because it was just during that month that the master was bringing off his big scheme. He was getting his bill through Parliament, and organizing a new medical police. But of course you haven't heard of all that. In fact, you weren't meant to." "Heard of all what?" asked the impatient inquirer. "There's a new law, and the asylum powers are greatly extended. Even if you did escape now, any policeman would take you up in the next town if you couldn't show a certificate of sanity from us." "Well," continued Dr. Hutton, "the master described before both houses of Parliament the real scientific objection to all existing legislation about lunacy. As he very truly said, the mistake is in supposing insanity to be merely an exception or an extreme. Insanity, like forgetfulness, is simply a quality which enters more or less into all human beings; and for practical purposes it is more necessary to know whose mind is really trustworthy than whose has some accidental taint. We have therefore reversed the existing method, and people now have to prove that they are sane. In the first village you entered, the village constable would notice that you were not wearing on the left lapel of your coat the small pewter S, which is now necessary to anyone who walks about beyond asylum bounds or outside asylum hours." "You mean to say," said Turnbull, "that this was what the master of the asylum urged before the House of Commons?" Dr. Hutton nodded with gravity. "And you mean to say," cried Turnbull, with a vibrant snort, "that that proposal was passed in an assembly that calls itself democratic?" The doctor showed his whole row of teeth in a smile. "Oh, the assembly calls itself socialist now," he said. "But we explained to them that this was a question for men of science." Turnbull gave one stamp upon the gravel, then pulled himself together and resumed. "But why should your infernal head medicine man lock us up in separate cells while he was turning England into a madhouse? I'm not the Prime Minister, we're not the House of Lords." "He wasn't afraid of the Prime Minister," replied Dr. Hutton. "He isn't afraid of the House of Lords, but—" "Well?" inquired Turnbull, stamping again. "He is afraid of you," said Hutton, simply. "Why, didn't you know?" MacIan, who had not spoken yet, made one stride forward and stood with shaking limbs and shining eyes. "He was afraid," began Evan, thickly. "You mean to say that we—" "I mean to say the plain truth now that the danger is over," said Hutton, calmly. "Most certainly you two were the only people he ever was afraid of." Then he added, in a low but not inaudible voice, "except one, whom he feared worse and was buried deeper." "Come away," cried MacIan. "This has to be thought about." Turnbull followed him in silence as he strode away, but just before he vanished, turned and spoke again to the doctors. "But what has got hold of people?" he asked abruptly. "Why should all England have gone dotty on the mere subject of dottiness?" Dr. Hutton smiled his open smile once more, and bowed slightly. "As to that also," he replied, "I don't want to make you vain." Turnbull swung round without a word, and he and his companion were lost in the lustrous leafage of the garden. They noticed nothing special about the scene, except that the garden seemed more exquisite than ever in the deepening sunset, and that there seemed to be many more people, whether patients or attendants, walking about in it. From behind the two black-coated doctors as they stood on the lawn another figure somewhat similarly dressed strode hurriedly past them, having also grizzled hair and an open flapping frock-coat. Both his decisive step and dapper black array marked him out as another medical man, or at least a man in authority, and as he passed Turnbull the latter was aroused by a strong impression of having seen the man somewhere before. It was no one that he knew well, yet he was certain that it was someone at whom he had at some time or other looked steadily. It was neither the face of a friend nor of an enemy. It aroused neither irritation nor tenderness, yet it was a face which had for some reason been of great importance in his life. Turning and returning, and making detours about the garden, he managed to study the man's face again and again, a mustached, somewhat military face with a monocle, the sort of face that is aristocratic without being distinguished. Turnbull could not remember any particular doctors in his decidedly healthy existence. Was the man a long-lost uncle, or was he only somebody who had sat opposite him regularly in a railway train? At that moment the man knocked down his own eyeglass with a gesture of annoyance. Turnbull remembered the gesture, and the truth sprang up solid in front of him. The man with the mustaches was Cumberland Vane, the London police magistrate before whom he and MacIan had once stood on their trial. The magistrate must have been transferred to some other official duties, to something connected with the inspection of asylums. Turnbull's heart gave a leap of excitement which was half hope. As a magistrate, Mr. Cumberland Vane had been somewhat careless and shallow, but certainly kindly, and not inaccessible to common sense so long as it was put to him in strictly conventional language. He was at least an authority of a more human and refreshing sort than the crank with the wagging beard or the fiend with the forked chin. He went straight up to the magistrate and said, "Good evening, Mr. Vane. I doubt if you'll remember me." Cumberland Vane screwed the eyeglass into his scowling face for an instant, and then said curtly but not uncivilly, "Yes, I remember you, sir. Assault or battery, wasn't it? A fellow broke your window. A tall fellow, something. Case made rather a noise afterwards." "MacIan is the name, sir," said Turnbull respectfully. "I have him here with me." "Eh!" said Vane very sharply. "Confound him! Has he got anything to do with this game?" "Mr. Vane," said Turnbull pacifically, "I will not pretend that either he or I acted quite decorously on that occasion. You were very lenient with us, and did not treat us as criminals when you very well might. So I am sure you will give us your testimony that, even if we were criminals, we were not lunatics in any legal or medical sense whatever. I am sure you will use your influence for us." "My influence?" repeated the magistrate with a slight start. "I don't quite understand you." "I don't know in what capacity you are here," continued Turnbull gravely, "but a legal authority of your distinction must certainly be here in an important one. Whether you are visiting and inspecting the place, or attached to it as some kind of permanent legal adviser, your opinion must still—" Cumberland Vane exploded with a detonation of oaths. His face was transfigured with fury and contempt, and yet in some odd way he did not seem specially angry with Turnbull. "But Lord bless us and save us!" he gasped at length. "I am not here as an official at all. I'm here as a patient. The cursed pack of rat-catching chemists all say that I've lost my wits." "You!" cried Turnbull with terrible emphasis. "You lost your wits!" In the rush of his real astonishment at this towering unreality, Turnbull almost added, "Why, you haven't got any to lose." But he fortunately remembered the remains of his desperate diplomacy. "This can't go on," he said positively. "Men like MacIan and I may suffer unjustly all our lives, but a man like you must have influence." "There is only one man who has any influence in England now," said Vane, and his high voice fell to a sudden and convincing quietude. "Whom do you mean?" asked Turnbull. "I mean that cursed fellow with the long split chin," said the other. "Is it really true," asked Turnbull, "that he has been allowed to buy up and control such a lot? What put the country into such a state?" Mr. Cumberland Vane laughed outright. "What put the country into such a state?" he asked. "Why, you did. When you were fool enough to agree to fight MacIan, after all, everybody was ready to believe that the Bank of England might paint itself pink with white spots." "I don't understand," replied Turnbull. "Why should you be surprised at my fighting? I hope I have always fought." "Well," said Cumberland Vane airily, "you didn't believe in religion, you see, so we thought you were safe at any rate. You went further in your language than most of us wanted to go, no good in just hurting one's mother's feelings, I think. But of course we all knew you were right, and really, we relied on you." "Did you?" said the editor of the Atheist with a bursting heart. "I am sorry you did not tell me so at the time." He walked away very rapidly and flung himself on a garden seat, and for some 6 minutes his own wrongs hid from him the huge and hilarious fact that Cumberland Vane had been locked up as a lunatic. The garden of the madhouse was so perfectly planned, and answered so exquisitely to every hour of daylight, that one could almost fancy that the sunlight was caught there tangled in its tinted trees, as the wise men of Gotham tried to chain the spring to a bush. Or it seemed as if this ironic paradise still kept its unique dawn or its special sunset, while the rest of the earthly globe rolled through its ordinary hours. There was one evening, or late afternoon in particular, which Evan MacIan will remember in the last moments of death. It was what artists call a daffodil sky, but it is coarsened even by reference to a daffodil. It was of that innocent lonely yellow which has never heard of orange, though it might turn quite unconsciously into green. Against it the tops, one might say the turrets, of the clipped and ordered trees were outlined in that shade of veiled violet which tints the tops of lavender. A white early moon was hardly traceable upon that delicate yellow. MacIan, I say, will remember this tender and transparent evening, partly because of its virgin gold and silver, and partly because he passed beneath it through a most horrible instant of his life. Turnbull was sitting on his seat on the lawn, and the golden evening impressed even his positive nature, as indeed it might have impressed the oxen in a field. He was shocked out of his idle mood of awe by seeing MacIan break from behind the bushes and run across the lawn with an action he had never seen in the man before, with all his experience of the eccentric humours of this Celt. MacIan fell on the bench, shaking it so that it rattled, and gripped it with his knees like one in dreadful pain of body. That particular run and tumble is typical only of a man who has been hit by some sudden and incurable evil, who is bitten by a viper or condemned to be hanged. Turnbull looked up in the white face of his friend and enemy, and almost turned cold at what he saw there. He had seen the blue but gloomy eyes of the Western Highlander troubled by as many tempests as his own West Highland seas, but there had always been a fixed star of faith behind the storms. Now the star had gone out, and there was only misery. Yet MacIan had the strength to answer the question where Turnbull, taken by surprise, had not the strength to ask it. "They are right, they are right!" he cried. "Oh, my God, they are right, Turnbull! I ought to be here!" He went on with shapeless fluency as if he no longer had the heart to choose or check his speech. "I suppose I ought to have guessed long ago, all my big dreams and schemes, and everyone being against us, but I was stuck up, you know." "Do tell me about it, really!" cried the atheist, and, faced with the furnace of the other's pain, he did not notice that he spoke with the affection of a father. "I am mad, Turnbull," said Evan, with dead clearness of speech, and leaned back against the garden seat. "Nonsense," said the other, clutching at the obvious cue of benevolent brutality. "This is one of your silly moods." MacIan shook his head. "I know enough about myself," he said, "to allow for any mood, though it opened heaven or hell. But to see things, to see them walking solid in the sun, things that can't be there, real mystics never do that, Turnbull." "What things?" asked the other, incredulously. MacIan lowered his voice. "I saw her," he said, "3 minutes ago, walking here in this hell yard." Between trying to look scornful and really looking startled, Turnbull's face was confused enough to emit no speech, and Evan went on in a monotonous sincerity. "I saw her walk behind those blessed trees against that holy sky of gold, as plain as I can see her whenever I shut my eyes. I did shut them, and opened them again, and she was still there. That is, of course she wasn't. She still had a little fur round her neck, but her dress was a shade brighter than when I really saw her." "My dear fellow," cried Turnbull, rallying a hearty laugh, "the fancies have really got hold of you. You mistook some other poor girl here for her." "Mistook some other—" said MacIan, and words failed him altogether. They sat for some moments in the mellow silence of the evening garden, a silence that was stifling for the skeptic, but utterly empty and final for the man of faith. At last he broke out again with the words, "Well, anyhow, if I am mad, I'm glad I'm mad on that." Turnbull murmured some clumsy deprecation, and sat stolidly smoking to collect his thoughts. The next instant he had all his nerves engaged in the mere effort to sit still. Across the clear space of cold silver and a pale lemon sky which was left by the gap in the ilex trees there passed a slim dark figure, a profile and the poise of a dark head like a bird's, which really pinned him to his seat with the point of coincidence. With an effort he got to his feet, and said with a voice of affected insouciance, "By George, MacIan, she is uncommonly like—" "What?" cried MacIan, with a leap of eagerness that was heartbreaking. "Do you see her too?" And the blaze came back into the centre of his eyes. Turnbull's brawny eyebrows were pulled together with a peculiar frown of curiosity, and all at once he walked quickly across the lawn. MacIan sat rigid, but peered after him with open and parched lips. He saw the sight which either proved him sane, or proved the whole universe half-witted. He saw the man of flesh approach the beautiful phantom, saw their gestures of recognition, and saw them against the sunset joining hands. He could stand it no longer, but ran across to the path, turned the corner, and saw standing quite palpable in the evening sunlight, talking with a casual grace to Turnbull, the face and figure which had filled his midnights with frightfully vivid or desperately half-forgotten features. She advanced quite pleasantly and coolly, and put out her hand. The moment that he touched it, he knew that he was sane, even if the solar system was crazy. She was entirely elegant and unembarrassed. That is the awful thing about women. They refuse to be emotional at emotional moments, upon some such ludicrous pretext as there being someone else there. But MacIan was in a condition of criticism much less than the average masculine one, being in fact merely overturned by the rushing riddle of the events. Evan does not know to this day what particular question he asked, but he vividly remembers that she answered, and every line or fluctuation of her face as she said it. "Oh, don't you know?" she said smiling, and suddenly lifting her level brown eyebrows. "Haven't you heard the news? I'm a lunatic." Then she added after a short pause, and with a sort of pride, "I've got a certificate." Her manner, by the matchless social stoicism of her sex, was entirely suited to a drawing-room, but Evan's reply fell somewhat far short of such a standard, as he only said, "What the devil in hell does all this nonsense mean?" "Really!" said the young lady, and laughed. "I beg your pardon," said the unhappy young man, rather wildly, "but what I mean is, why are you here in an asylum?" The young woman broke again into one of the maddening and mysterious laughs of femininity. Then she composed her features, and replied with equal dignity, "Well, if it comes to that, why are you?" The fact that Turnbull had strolled away and was investigating rhododendrons may have been due to Evan's successful prayers to the other world, or possibly to his own pretty successful experience of this one. But though they two were as isolated as a new Adam and Eve in a pretty ornamental Eden, the lady did not relax by an inch the rigor of her badinage. "I am locked up in the madhouse," said Evan, with a sort of stiff pride, "because I tried to keep my promise to you." "Quite so," answered the inexplicable lady, nodding with a perfectly blazing smile. "And I am locked up because it was to me you promised." "It is outrageous!" cried Evan. "It is impossible!" "Oh, you can see my certificate if you like," she replied with some hauteur. MacIan stared at her, and then at his boots, and then at the sky, and then at her again. He was quite sure now that he himself was not mad, and the fact rather added to his perplexity. Then he drew nearer to her, and said in a dry and dreadful voice, "Oh, don't condescend to play the fool with such a fool as me. Are you really locked up here as a patient, because you helped us to escape?" "Yes," she said, still smiling, but her steady voice had a shake in it. Evan flung his big elbow across his forehead and burst into tears. The pure lemon of the sky faded into purer white as the great sunset silently collapsed. The birds settled back into the trees, the moon began to glow with its own light. Mr. James Turnbull continued his botanical researches into the structure of the rhododendron. But the lady did not move an inch until Evan had flung up his face again, and when he did he saw by the last gleam of sunlight that it was not only his face that was wet. Mr. James Turnbull had all his life professed a profound interest in physical science, and the phenomena of a good garden were really a pleasure to him. But after 3/4 of an hour or so, even the apostle of science began to find rhododendrons a bore, and was somewhat relieved when an unexpected development of events obliged him to transfer his researches to the equally interesting subject of hollyhocks, which grew some 50 feet farther along the path. The ostensible cause of his removal was the unexpected reappearance of his 2 other acquaintances walking and talking laboriously along the way, with the black head bent close to the brown one. Even hollyhocks detained Turnbull but a short time. Having rapidly absorbed all the important principles affecting the growth of those vegetables, he jumped over a flower bed and walked back into the building. The other 2 came up along the slow course of the path, talking and talking. No one but God knows what they said, for they certainly have forgotten, and if I remembered it I would not repeat it. When they parted at the end of the walk, she put out her hand again in the same well-bred way, though it trembled. He seemed to restrain a gesture as he let it fall. "If it is really always to be like this," he said thickly, "it would not matter if we were here forever." "You tried to kill yourself 4 times for me," she said unsteadily, "and I have been chained up as a madwoman for you. I really think that after that—" "Yes, I know," said Evan in a low voice, looking down. "After that we belong to each other. We are sort of sold to each other until the stars fall." Then he looked up suddenly and said, "By the way, what is your name?" "My name is Beatrice Drake," she replied with complete gravity. "You can see it on my certificate of lunacy." End of chapter 18. Recording by Trisha G. Of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 19. The Last Parley. Turnbull walked away, wildly trying to explain to himself the presence of 2 personal acquaintances so different as Vane and the girl. As he skirted a low hedge of laurel, an enormously tall young man leapt over it, stood in front of him, and almost fell on his neck as if seeking to embrace him. "Don't you know me?" almost sobbed the young man, who was in the highest spirits. "Ain't I written on your heart, old boy? I say, what did you do with my yacht?" "Take your arms off my neck," said Turnbull, irritably. "Are you mad?" The young man sat down on the gravel path and went into ecstasies of laughter. "No, that's just the fun of it. I'm not mad," he replied. "They've shut me up in this place, and I'm not mad." And he went off again into mirth as innocent as wedding bells. Turnbull, whose powers of surprise were exhausted, rolled his round grey eyes and said, "Mr. Wilkinson, I think," because he could not think of anything else to say. The tall man sitting on the gravel bowed with urbanity, and said, "Quite at your service. Not to be confused with the Wilkinsons of Cumberland, and, as I say, old boy, what have you done with my yacht? You see, they've locked me up here in this garden, and a yacht would be a sort of occupation for an unmarried man." "I am really horribly sorry," began Turnbull, in the last stage of bated bewilderment and exasperation, "but really—" "Oh, I can see you can't have it on you at the moment," said Mr. Wilkinson, with much intellectual magnanimity. "Well, the fact is," began Turnbull again, and then the phrase was frozen in his mouth, for round the corner came the goat-like face and gleaming eyeglasses of Dr. Quayle. "Ah, my dear Mr. Wilkinson," said the doctor, as if delighted at a coincidence. "And Mr. Turnbull, too! Why, I want to speak to Mr. Turnbull." Mr. Turnbull made some movement rather of surrender than of assent, and the doctor caught it up exquisitely, showing even more of his 2 front teeth. "I am sure Mr. Wilkinson will excuse us a moment." And with flying frock-coat he led Turnbull rapidly round the corner of a path. "My dear sir," he said in a quite affectionate manner, "I do not mind telling you, you are such a very hopeful case, you understand so well the scientific point of view, and I don't like to see you bothered by the really hopeless cases. They are monotonous and maddening. The man you have just been talking to, poor fellow, is one of the strongest cases of pure idée fixe that we have. It's very sad, and I am afraid utterly incurable. He keeps on telling everybody," and the doctor lowered his voice confidentially, "he tells everybody that two people have taken his yacht. His account of how he lost it is quite incoherent." Turnbull stamped his foot on the gravel path and called out, "Oh, I can't stand this! Really—" "I know," said the psychologist mournfully. "It is a most melancholy case, and also fortunately a very rare one. It is so rare, in fact, that in one classification of these maladies it is entered under a heading by itself, perennially, mental inflammation creating the impression that one has lost a ship. Really," he said with a kind of half-embarrassed guilt, "it's rather a feather in my cap. I discovered the only existing case of perennially." "But this won't do, doctor," said Turnbull, almost tearing his hair. "This really won't do. The man really did lose a ship. Indeed, not to put too fine a point on it, I took his ship." Dr. Quayle swung round for an instant so that his silk-lined overcoat rustled, and stared singularly at Turnbull. Then he said, with hurried amiability, "Why, of course you did. Quite so, quite so," and with courteous gestures went striding up the garden path. Under the first laburnum tree he stopped, however, and pulling out his pencil and notebook wrote down feverishly, "Singular development in the elenthoromaniac, Turnbull. Sudden manifestation of rapinavititis, the delusion that one has stolen a ship. First case ever recorded." Turnbull stood for an instant staggered into stillness. Then he ran raging round the garden to find MacIan, just as a husband, even a bad husband, will run raging to find his wife if he is full of a furious query. He found MacIan stalking moodily about the half-lit garden after his extraordinary meeting with Beatrice. No one who saw his slouching stride and sunken head could have known that his soul was in the seventh heaven of ecstasy. He did not think, he did not even very definitely desire. He merely wallowed in memories, chiefly in material memories, words said with a certain cadence or trivial turns of the neck or wrist. Into the middle of his stationary and senseless enjoyment were thrust abruptly the projecting elbow and the projecting red beard of Turnbull. MacIan stepped back a little, and the soul in his eyes came very slowly to its windows. When James Turnbull had the glittering sword point planted upon his breast, he was in far less danger. For 3 pulsating seconds after the interruption MacIan was in a mood to have murdered his father. And yet his whole emotional anger fell from him when he saw Turnbull's face, in which the eyes seemed to be bursting from the head like bullets. All the fire and fragrance even of young and honourable love faded for a moment before that stiff agony of interrogation. "Are you hurt, Turnbull?" he asked anxiously. "I am dying," answered the other quite calmly. "I am in the quite literal sense of the words dying to know something. I want to know what all this can possibly mean." MacIan did not answer, and he continued with asperity. "You are still thinking about that girl, but I tell you the whole thing is incredible. She is not the only person here. I've met the fellow Wilkinson whose yacht we lost. I've met the very magistrate you were hauled up to when you broke my window. What can it mean, meeting all these old people again? One never meets such old friends again except in a dream." Then after a silence he cried with a rending sincerity, "Are you really there, Evan? Have you ever really been there? Am I simply dreaming?" Evan had been listening with a living silence to every word, and now his face flamed with one of his rare revelations of life. "No, you good atheist," he cried. "No, you clean, courteous, reverend, pious old blasphemer. No, you are not dreaming. You are waking up." "What do you mean?" "There are 2 states where one meets so many old friends," said MacIan. "One is a dream, the other is the end of the world." "And you say—" "I say this is not a dream," said Evan in a ringing voice. "You really mean to suggest—" began Turnbull. "Be silent, or I shall say it all wrong," said MacIan, breathing hard. It's hard to explain, anyhow. An apocalypse is the opposite of a dream. A dream is falser than the outer life. But the end of the world is more actual than the world it ends. I don't say this is really the end of the world, but it's something like that. It's the end of something. All the people are crowding into one corner. Everything is coming to a point." "What is the point?" asked Turnbull. "I can't see it," said Evan. "It is too large and plain." Then after a silence he said, "I can't see it, and yet I will try to describe it. Turnbull, 3 days ago I saw quite suddenly that our duel was not right after all." "3 days ago!" repeated Turnbull. "When and why did this illumination occur?" "I knew I was not quite right," answered Evan, "the moment I saw the round eyes of that old man in the cell." "Old man in the cell!" repeated his wondering companion. "Do you mean the poor old idiot who liked spikes to stick out?" "Yes," said MacIan after a slight pause, "I mean the poor old idiot who liked spikes to stick out. When I saw his eyes and heard his old croaking accent, I knew that it would not really have been right to kill you. It would have been a venial sin." "I am much obliged," said Turnbull, gruffly. "You must give me time," said MacIan quite patiently, "for I am trying to tell the whole truth. I am trying to tell more of it than I know." "So you see, I confess," he went on with laborious distinctness, "I confess that all the people who called our duel mad were right in a way. I would confess it to old Cumberland Vane in his eyeglass. I would confess it even to that old ass in brown flannel who talked to us about love. Yes, they are right in a way. I am a little mad." He stopped and wiped his brow as if he were literally doing heavy labour. Then he went on. "I am a little mad, but, after all, it is only a little madness. When hundreds of high-minded men had fought duels about a jostle with the elbow or the ace of spades, the whole world need not have gone wild over my one little wildness. Plenty of other people have killed themselves between then and now. But all England has gone into captivity in order to take us captive. All England has turned into a lunatic asylum in order to prove us lunatics. Compared with the general public, I might positively be called sane." He stopped again, and went on with the same air of travailing with the truth. "When I saw that, I saw everything. I saw the Church and the world. The Church in its earthly action has really touched morbid things, tortures and bleeding visions and blasts of extermination. The Church has had her madnesses, and I am one of them. I am the massacre of St. Bartholomew. I am the Inquisition of Spain. I do not say that we have never gone mad, but I say that we are fit to act as keepers to our enemies. Massacre is wicked even with a provocation, as in the Bartholomew. But your modern Nietzsche will tell you that massacre would be glorious without a provocation. Torture should be violently stopped, though the Church is doing it. But your modern Tolstoy will tell you that it ought not to be violently stopped whoever is doing it. In the long run, which is most mad, the Church or the world? Which is madder, the Spanish priest who permitted tyranny, or the Prussian sophist who admired it? Which is madder, the Russian priest who discourages righteous rebellion, or the Russian novelist who forbids it? That is the final and blasting test. The world left to itself grows wilder than any creed. A few days ago, you and I were the maddest people in England. Now, by God, I believe we are the sanest. That is the only real question, whether the Church is really madder than the world. Let the rationalists run their own race, and let us see where they end. If the world has some healthy balance other than God, let the world find it. Does the world find it? Cut the world loose!" he cried with a savage gesture. "Does the world stand on its own end? Does it stand, or does it stagger?" Turnbull remained silent, and MacIan said to him, looking once more at the earth, "It staggers, Turnbull. It cannot stand by itself. You know it cannot. It has been the sorrow of your life. Turnbull, this garden is not a dream, but an apocalyptic fulfilment. This garden is the world gone mad." Turnbull did not move his head, and he had been listening all the time; yet, somehow, the other knew that for the first time he was listening seriously. "The world has gone mad," said MacIan, "and it has gone mad about us. The world takes the trouble to make a big mistake about every little mistake made by the Church. That is why they have turned 10 counties into a madhouse. That is why crowds of kindly people are poured into this filthy melting pot. Now is the judgment of this world. The prince of this world is judged, and he is judged exactly because he is judging. There is at last one simple solution to the quarrel between the ball and the cross." Turnbull for the first time started. "The ball and—" he repeated. "What is the matter with you?" asked MacIan. "I had a dream," said Turnbull thickly and obscurely, "in which I saw the cross struck crooked and the ball secure—" "I had a dream," said MacIan, "in which I saw the cross erect and the ball invisible. They were both dreams from hell. There must be some round earth to plant the cross upon. But here is the awful difference, that the round world will not consent even to continue round. The astronomers are always telling us that it is shaped like an orange, or like an egg, or like a German sausage. They beat the old world about like a bladder and thump it into 1,000 shapeless shapes. Turnbull, we cannot trust the ball to be always a ball. We cannot trust reason to be reasonable. In the end the great terrestrial globe will go quite lopsided, and only the cross will stand upright." There was a long silence, and then Turnbull said, hesitatingly, "Has it occurred to you that since those 2 dreams, or whatever they were—" "Well?" murmured MacIan. "Since then," went on Turnbull in the same low voice, "since then we have never even looked for our swords." "You are right," answered MacIan, almost inaudibly. "We have found something which we both hate more than we ever hated each other, and I think I know its name." Turnbull seemed to frown and flinch for a moment. "It does not much matter what you call it," he said, "so long as you keep out of its way." The bushes broke and snapped abruptly behind them, and a very tall figure towered above Turnbull with an arrogant stoop and a projecting chin, a chin of which the shape showed queerly even in its shadow upon the path. "You see it is not so easy," said MacIan between his teeth. They looked up into the eyes of the Master, but looked only for a moment. The eyes were full of a frozen and icy wrath, a kind of utterly heartless hatred. His voice was for the first time devoid of irony. There was no more sarcasm in it than there was in an iron club. "You will be inside the building in 3 minutes," he said, with pulverizing precision, "or you will be fired on by the artillery at all the windows. There is too much talking in this garden. We intend to close it. You will be accommodated indoors." "Ah," said MacIan, with a long and satisfied sigh, "then I was right." And he turned his back and walked obediently towards the building. Turnbull seemed to canvass for a few minutes the notion of knocking the Master down, and then fell under the same almost fairy fatalism as his companion. In some strange way it did seem that the more smoothly they yielded, the more swiftly would events sweep on to some great collision. Chapter 20 of the Ball and the Cross. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton. Chapter 20. Dies Irae. As they advanced towards the asylum they looked up at its rows on rows of windows and understood the Master's material threat. By means of that complex but concealed machinery which ran like a network of nerves over the whole fabric, there had been shot out under every window ledge rows and rows of polished steel cylinders, the cold miracles of modern gunnery. They commanded the whole garden and the whole countryside, and could have blown to pieces an army corps. This silent declaration of war had evidently had its complete effect. As MacIan and Turnbull walked steadily but slowly towards the entrance hall of the institution, they could see that most, or at least many, of the patients had already gathered there, as well as the staff of doctors and the whole regiment of keepers and assistants. But when they entered the lamp-lit hall, and the high iron door was clashed to and locked behind them, yet a new amazement leapt into their eyes, and the stalwart Turnbull almost fell. For he saw a sight which was indeed, as MacIan had said, either the day of judgment or a dream. Within a few feet of him, at one corner of the square of standing people, stood the girl he had known in Jersey, Madeleine Durand. She looked straight at him with a steady smile which lit up the scene of darkness and unreason like the light of some honest fireside. Her square face and throat were thrown back, as her habit was, and there was something almost sleepy in the geniality of her eyes. He saw her first, and for a few seconds saw her only. Then the outer edge of his eyesight took in all the other staring faces, and he saw all the faces he had ever seen for weeks and months past. There was the Tolstoyan in Jaeger flannel, with the yellow beard that went backward and the foolish nose and eyes that went forward, with the curiosity of a crank. He was talking eagerly to Mr. Gordon, the corpulent Jew shopkeeper whom they had once gagged in his own shop. There was the tipsy old Hertfordshire rustic. He was talking energetically to himself. There was not only Mr. Vane the magistrate, but the clerk of Mr. Vane the magistrate. There was not only Miss Drake of the motor car, but also Miss Drake's chauffeur. Nothing wild or unfamiliar could have produced upon Turnbull such a nightmare impression as that ring of familiar faces. Yet he had one intellectual shock which was greater than all the others. He stepped impulsively forward towards Madeleine, and then wavered with a kind of wild humility. As he did so he caught sight of another square face behind Madeleine's, a face with long grey whiskers and an austere stare. It was old Durand, the girl's father, and when Turnbull saw him, he saw the last and worst marvel of that monstrous night. He remembered Durand. He remembered his monotonous, everlasting lucidity, his stupefyingly sensible views of everything, his colossal contentment with truisms merely because they were true. "Confound it all!" cried Turnbull to himself. "If he is in the asylum, there can't be anyone outside." He drew nearer to Madeleine, but still doubtfully and all the more so because she still smiled at him. MacIan had already gone across to Beatrice with an air of fright. Then all these bewildered but partly amicable recognitions were cloven by a cruel voice which always made all human blood turn bitter. The master was standing in the middle of the room surveying the scene like a great artist looking at a completed picture. Handsome as he looked, they had never seen so clearly what was really hateful in his face, and even then they could only express it by saying that the arched brows and the long emphatic chin gave it always a look of being lit from below, like the face of some infernal actor. "This is indeed a cosy party," he said, with glittering eyes. The master evidently meant to say more, but before he could say anything, Monsieur Durand had stepped right up to him and was speaking. He was speaking exactly as a French bourgeois speaks to the manager of a restaurant; that is, he spoke with rattling and breathless rapidity, but with no incoherence, and therefore with no emotion. It was a steady, monotonous vivacity, which came not seemingly from passion, but merely from the reason having been sent off at a gallop. He was saying something like this: "You refuse me my half bottle of Médoc, the drink the most wholesome and the most customary. You refuse me the company and obedience of my daughter, which nature herself indicates. You refuse me the beef and mutton, without pretense that it is a fast of the church. You now forbid me the promenade, a thing necessary to a person of my age. It is useless to tell me that you do all this by law. Law rests upon the social contract. If the citizen finds himself despoiled of such pleasures and powers as he would have had even in the savage state, the social contract is annulled." "It's no good chattering away, monsieur," said Hutton, for the master was silent. "The place is covered with machine guns. We've got to obey our orders, and so have you." "The machinery is of the most perfect," assented Durand, somewhat irrelevantly. "Worked by petroleum, I believe. I only ask you to admit that if such things fall below the comfort of barbarism, the social contract is annulled. It is a pretty little point of theory." "Oh, I dare say," said Hutton. Durand bowed quite civilly and withdrew. "A cosy party," resumed the Master scornfully, "and yet I believe some of you are in doubt about how we all came together. I will explain it, ladies and gentlemen. I will explain everything. To whom shall I specially address myself? To Mr. James Turnbull. He has a scientific mind." Turnbull seemed to choke with sudden protest. The Master seemed only to cough out of pure politeness, and proceeded. "Mr. Turnbull will agree with me," he said, "when I say that we long felt in scientific circles that great harm was done by such a legend as that of the crucifixion." Turnbull growled something which was presumably assent. The Master went on smoothly. "It was in vain for us to urge that the incident was irrelevant, that there were many such fanatics, many such executions. We were forced to take the thing thoroughly in hand, to investigate it in the spirit of scientific history, and with the assistance of Mr. Turnbull and others, we were happy in being able to announce that this alleged crucifixion never occurred at all." MacIan lifted his head and looked at the Master steadily, but Turnbull did not look up. "This, we found, was the only way with all superstitions," continued the speaker. "It was necessary to deny them historically, and we have done it with great success in the case of miracles and such things. Now within our own time there arose an unfortunate fuss which threatened, as Mr. Turnbull would say, to galvanize the corpse of Christianity into a fictitious life, the alleged case of a Highland eccentric who wanted to fight for the Virgin." MacIan, quite white, made a step forward, but the speaker did not alter his easy attitude or his flow of words. "Again we urged that this duel was not to be admired, that it was a mere brawl, but the people were ignorant and romantic. There were signs of treating this alleged Highlander and his alleged opponent as heroes. We tried all other means of arresting this reactionary hero worship. Working men who betted on the duel were imprisoned for gambling. Working men who drank the health of a duelist were imprisoned for drunkenness. But the popular excitement about the alleged duel continued, and we had to fall back on our old historical method. We investigated, on scientific principles, the story of MacIan's challenge, and we are happy to be able to inform you that the whole story of the attempted duel is a fable. There never was any challenge. There never was any man named MacIan. It is a melodramatic myth, like Calvary." Not a soul moved save Turnbull, who lifted his head. Yet there was the sense of a silent explosion. "The whole story of the MacIan challenge," went on the Master, beaming at them all with a sinister benignity, "has been found to originate in the obsessions of a few pathological types, who are now all fortunately in our care. There is, for instance, a person here of the name of Gordon, formerly the keeper of a curiosity shop. He is the victim of a disease called vinculomania, the impression that one has been bound or tied up. We have also a case of fugacity, Mr. Wimpey, who imagines that he was chased by two men." The indignant faces of the Jew shopkeeper and the Magdalen Doan started out of the crowd in their indignation, but the speaker continued. "One poor woman we have with us," he said, in a compassionate voice, "believes she was in a motor car with two such men. This is the well-known illusion of speed on which I need not dwell. Another wretched woman has the simple egotistic mania that she has caused the duel. Madeline Durand actually professes to have been the subject of the fight between MacIan and his enemy, a fight which, if it occurred at all, certainly began long before. But it never occurred at all. We have taken in hand every person who professed to have seen such a thing, and proved them all to be unbalanced. That is why they are here." The Master looked round the room, just showing his perfect teeth with the perfection of artistic cruelty, exulted for a moment in the enormous simplicity of his success, and then walked across the hall and vanished through an inner door. His two lieutenants, Quayle and Hutton, were left standing at the head of the great army of servants and keepers. "I hope we shall have no more trouble," said Dr. Quayle pleasantly enough, and addressing Turnbull, who was leaning heavily upon the back of a chair. Still looking down, Turnbull lifted the chair an inch or two from the ground. Then he suddenly swung it above his head and sent it at the inquiring doctor with an awful crash which sent one of its wooden legs loose along the floor and crammed the doctor gasping into a corner. MacIan gave a great shout, snatched up the loose chair leg, and, rushing on the other doctor, felled him with a blow. 20 attendants rushed to capture the rebels. MacIan flung back 3 of them, and Turnbull went over on top of one, when from behind them all came a shriek as of something quite fresh and frightful. 2 of the 3 passages leading out of the hall were choked with blue smoke. Another instant and the hall was full of the fog of it, and red sparks began to swarm like scarlet bees. "The place is on fire!" cried Quayle with a scream of indecent terror. "Oh, who can have done it? How can it have happened?" A light had come into Turnbull's eyes. "How did the French Revolution happen?" he asked. "Oh, how should I know?" wailed the other. "Then I will tell you," said Turnbull. "It happened because some people fancied that a French grocer was as respectable as he looked." Even as he spoke, as if by confirmation, old Mr. Durand re-entered the smoky room quite placidly, wiping the petroleum from his hands with a handkerchief. He had set fire to the building in accordance with the strict principles of the social contract. But MacIan had taken a stride forward and stood there shaken and terrible. "Now," he cried panting, "now is the judgment of the world. The doctors will leave this place, the keepers will leave this place. They will leave us in charge of the machinery and the machine guns at the windows. But we, the lunatics, will wait to be burned alive if only we may see them go." "How do you know we shall go?" asked Hutton fiercely. "You believe nothing," said MacIan simply, "and you are insupportably afraid of death." "So this is suicide," sneered the doctor, "a somewhat doubtful sign of sanity." "Not at all. This is vengeance," answered Turnbull quite calmly, "a thing which is completely healthy." "You think the doctors will go," said Hutton savagely. "The keepers have gone already," said Turnbull. Even as they spoke the main doors were burst open in mere brutal panic, and all the officers and subordinates of the asylum rushed away across the garden pursued by the smoke. But among the ticketed maniacs not a man or woman moved. "We hate dying," said Turnbull with composure, "but we hate you even more. This is a successful revolution." In the roof above their heads a panel shot back, showing a strip of starlit sky and a huge thing made of white metal, with the shape and fins of a fish, swinging as if at anchor. At the same moment a steel ladder slid down from the opening and struck the floor, and the cleft chin of the mysterious master was thrust into the opening. "Quayle, Hutton," he said, "you will escape with me," and they went up the ladder like automata of lead. Long after they had clambered into the car, the creature with the cloven face continued to leer down upon the smoke-stung crowd below. Then at last he said in a silken voice and with a smile of final satisfaction, "By the way, I fear I am very absent-minded. There is one man specially whom, somehow, I always forget. I always leave him lying about. Once I mislaid him on the cross of St. Paul's. So silly of me! And now I've forgotten him in one of those little cells where your fire is burning. Very unfortunate, especially for him." And nodding genially, he climbed into his flying ship. MacIan stood motionless for 2 minutes, and then rushed down one of the suffocating corridors till he found the flames. Turnbull looked once at Madeleine and followed. MacIan, with singed hair, smoking garments, and smarting hands and face, had already broken far enough through the first barriers of burning timber to come within cry of the cells he had once known. It was impossible, however, to see the spot where the old man lay dead or alive, not now through darkness, but through scorching and aching light. The site of the old half-wit's cell was now the heart of a standing forest of fire, the flames as thick and yellow as a cornfield. Their incessant shrieking and crackling was like a mob shouting against an orator. Yet through all that deafening density MacIan thought he heard a small and separate sound. When he heard it, he rushed forward as if to plunge into that furnace, but Turnbull arrested him by an elbow. "Let me go," cried Evan in agony. "It is the poor old beggar's voice. He's still alive and shouting for help." "Listen," said Turnbull, and lifted one finger from his clenched hand. "Or else he is shrieking with pain," protested MacIan. "I will not endure it." "Listen," repeated Turnbull, grimly. "Did you ever hear anyone shout for help or shriek with pain in that voice?" The small shrill sounds which came through the crash of the conflagration were indeed of an odd sort, and MacIan turned a face of puzzled inquiry to his companion. "He is singing," said Turnbull, simply. A remaining rampart fell, crushing the fire, and through the diminished din of it the voice of the little old lunatic came clearer. In the heart of that white-hot hell he was singing like a bird. What he was singing was not very easy to follow, but it seemed to be something about playing in the golden hay. "Good Lord!" cried Turnbull, bitterly. There seemed to be some advantages in really being an idiot. Then advancing to the fringe of the fire, he called out on chance to the invisible singer, "Can you come out? Are you cut off?" "God help us all," said MacIan with a shudder. "He's laughing now." At whatever stage of being burned alive the invisible now found himself, he was now shaking out peals of silvery and hilarious laughter. As he listened, MacIan's two eyes began to glow, as if a strange thought had come into his head. "Fool, come out and save yourself!" shouted Turnbull. "No, by heaven, that is not the way!" cried Evan suddenly. "Father!" he shouted, "come out and save us all!" The fire, though it had dropped in one or two places, was, upon the whole, higher and more unconquerable than ever. Separate tall flames shot up and spread out above them like the fiery cloisters of some infernal cathedral, or like a grove of red tropical trees in the garden of the devil. Higher yet in the purple hollow of the night, the topmost flames leapt again and again fruitlessly at the stars, like golden dragons chained but struggling. The towers and domes of the oppressive smoke seemed high and far enough to drown distant planets in a London fog. But if we exhausted all frantic similes for that frantic scene, the main impression about the fire would still be its ranked upstanding rigidity and a sort of roaring stillness. It was literally a wall of fire. "Father!" cried MacIan once more. "Come out of it and save us all!" Turnbull was staring at him as he cried. The tall and steady forest of fire must have been already a portent visible to the whole circle of land and sea. The red flush of it lit up the long sides of white ships far out in the German Ocean, and picked out like piercing rubies the windows in the villages on the distant heights. If any villagers or sailors were looking towards it, they must have seen a strange sight as MacIan cried out for the third time. That forest of fire wavered and was cloven in the center, and then the whole of one half of it leaned one way as a cornfield leans all one way under the load of the wind. Indeed, it looked as if a great wind had sprung up and driven the great fire aslant. Its smoke was no longer sent up to choke the stars, but was trailed and dragged across county after county like one dreadful banner of defeat. But it was not the wind. Or if it was the wind, it was two winds blowing in opposite directions, for while one half of the huge fire sloped one way towards the inland heights, the other half, at exactly the same angle, sloped out eastward towards the sea, so that earth and ocean could behold, where there had been a mere fiery mass, a thing divided like a V, a cloven tongue of flame. But if it were a prodigy for those distant, it was something beyond speech for those quite near. As the echoes of Evan's last appeal rang and died in the universal uproar, the fiery vault over his head opened down the middle, and, reeling back in two great golden billows, hung on each side as huge and harmless as two sloping hills lie on each side of a valley. Down the center of this trough, or chasm, a little path ran, cleared of all but ashes, and down this little path was walking a little old man, singing as if he were alone in a wood at spring. When James Turnbull saw this, he suddenly put out a hand and seemed to support himself on the strong shoulder of Madeleine Durand. Then after a moment's hesitation he put his other hand on the shoulder of MacIan. His blue eyes looked extraordinarily brilliant and beautiful. In many skeptical papers and magazines afterwards he was sadly or sternly rebuked for having abandoned the certainties of materialism. All his life up to that moment he had been most honestly certain that materialism was a fact. But he was unlike the writers in the magazines precisely in this, that he preferred a fact even to materialism. As the little singing figure came nearer and nearer, Evan fell on his knees, and after an instant Beatrice followed. Then Madeleine fell on her knees, and after a longer instant Turnbull followed. Then the little old man went past them, singing down that corridor of flames. They had not looked at his face. When he had passed they looked up. While the first light of the fire had shot east and west, painting the sides of ships with firelight or striking red sparks out of windowed houses, it had not hitherto struck upward, for there was above it the ponderous and rococo cavern of its own monstrous colored smoke. But now the fire was turned to left and right like a woman's hair parted in the middle, and now the shafts of its light could shoot up into empty heavens and strike anything, either bird or cloud. But it struck something that was neither cloud nor bird. Far, far away up in those huge hollows of space, something was flying swiftly and shining brightly, something that shone too bright and flew too fast to be any of the fowls of the air, though the red light lit it from underneath like the breast of a bird. Everyone knew it was a flying ship, and everyone knew whose. As they stared upward, the little speck of light seemed slightly tilted, and two black dots dropped from the edge of it. All the eager, upturned faces watched the two dots as they grew bigger and bigger in their downward rush. Then someone screamed, and no one looked up any more. For the two bodies, larger every second flying, spread out and sprawling in the firelight, were the dead bodies of the two doctors whom Professor Lucifer had carried with him, the weak and sneering Quayle, the cold and clumsy Hutton. They went with a crash into the thick of the fire. "They are gone!" screamed Beatrice, hiding her head. "Oh, God, they are lost!" Evan put his arm about her, and remembered his own vision. "No, they are not lost," he said. "They are saved. He has taken away no souls with him, after all." He looked vaguely about at the fire that was already fading, and there among the ashes lay two shining things that had survived the fire, his sword and Turnbull's, fallen haphazard in the pattern of a cross. End of chapter 20. Recording by Trisha G. End of The Ball and the Cross by G.K. Chesterton.